I have a feeling that there is much more distrust among Polish people living in the UK than among Brits.
I was listening to conversations among Polish people that I know. Some people were saying, I'm never going to have the vaccine. And after about the fifth conversation like this, I started to look into it and I realised that it actually was a massive problem.
It's sort of built into Poles' DNA, effectively, to not always have to trust what you're told publicly.
Poland has spent such a long part of its recent history in a kind of Orwellian reality. So fewer logical steps need to be taken to believe that the government is out to get you or that this is a foreign plot, because they're things that have actually happened.
We were already lied to once, so who is to say it's not happening again?
Since the start of this year, millions of people have been vaccinated against COVID-19. Having had one of the worst death rates in Europe at the start of the pandemic, a mostly successful vaccine rollout is starting to make things look a bit more normal. However, despite all this, vaccine hesitancy remains a major issue among minority communities, and right now, British Poles are experiencing issues of trust around the vaccine. Although there's no data on vaccine hesitancy in the UK's Polish community, we do have data on vaccine hesitancy from most European countries. In Spain, for instance, 74% of people say they would take up the vaccine. In the UK, that figure is 71%. This compares to just 56% in Poland, with Russia being the only country with a lower rate. These anti-vax feelings seem to be sweeping across borders and overseas. Anya Kokorum and Dr. Tomasz Nierowski both say they have first-hand evidence of this. They moved from Poland to the UK over 30 years ago, but have family who still live there.
Certain sources just keep sending me so many messages via WhatsApp with film clips, and that started when the pandemic started. So first of all, they were about pandemic and that it's false, and then of course once the vaccines were being developed in the years, they started sending messages about vaccines and trying to persuade me not to have them.
I speak with my mom, and you would think that she will listen to me, and she won't. So, and you know, I know that my mom is not an exemption from the rule, I'm sure.
It looks like this reluctance is indeed being felt by Poles in the UK. Their concerns are being highlighted online, and Polish organisations are working to tackle the problem. A few weeks ago, I watched a Q&A on COVID vaccinations, hosted by the Polish Social and Cultural Association. Within minutes, it became clear that vaccine hesitancy is a major issue in the community.
Tak nie działają te szczepionki, o których mówimy w tym przypadku Pfizera i AstraZeneki. To są szczepionki nowej generacji i tutaj nie wszczepia się koronawirusa, nie wszczepia się osłabionego koronawirusa, niczego takiego.
Trzeba pamiętać, że te skutki uboczne, które są zazwyczaj, są skutkami, które są do przewidzenia. To jest
Research shows COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy could cause an additional 236 deaths per million population, not to mention a potential for new COVID variants. This should make tackling vaccine hesitancy a key political priority, especially as groups most reluctant to take the vaccine are most likely to be disproportionately affected by the virus. I want an idea of the scale of this problem. People up and down the country who are well connected to the Polish community have agreed to talk to me about it. Am I right in saying that you think lots of Polish people are worried about being vaccinated?
So this is largely based on what I read on social media and what I sense from people I know. So it's anecdata rather than proper data. But I have a feeling that there is much more distrust among Polish people living in the UK than among Brits.
I was listening to conversations among Polish people that I know. And they were all so worried about the vaccine. Some people were saying, I'm never going to have the vaccine. And after about the fifth conversation like this, I was like, this is so unusual and so different to any conversation I've heard among British people. And so then that's when I started to look into it. And I realised that it actually was a massive problem.
There are almost 700,000 Poles living in the UK. That makes the community the second largest cultural minority in the country. The region with the largest Polish population is London, with the East, East Midlands, North West and South East also having sizable communities. In the capital alone, there are nearly 150,000 Polish speakers. Given the size of the Polish population, many are worried about vaccine hesitancy in the community. Professor Helen Bedford is one of those people. She's a senior lecturer in children's health and has conducted research into the determinants of vaccine uptake.
If the whole population isn't immune, if you like, if we haven't got, I prefer to call it community immunity than herd immunity. But that's the big risk, that if we have pockets of where you don't have immunity, that you might get new variants.
Dr. Tomasz Nieralski, Vice President of Medical Services at TMC Pharma, says the importance of vaccination should not be understated.
I'm sure you might have seen in the media the consequences of polio, some old pictures before the polio vaccinations weren't as widespread, how significant disease it was, and how much the vaccination helped. And I have many other epidemiological examples where, for example, the hepatitis B vaccination changed completely the trajectory of infections in Poland.
But this isn't the first time British Poles have shown reluctance towards being vaccinated. 4 years ago, the Vaccine Confidence Project found that just 25% of Polish children in Scotland had been vaccinated against flu. That's compared to 71% of UK-born children. Action clearly needs to be taken to tackle vaccine hesitancy among British Poles. But to figure out what that action should be, we need to know why this is an issue in the Polish community.
We've got to find out what's going on. So, you do a big study, find out that only 25% of Polish children in Scotland are immunised. So the next thing to do against flu, is to go and talk to the communities and find out, what their beliefs and understanding are, and then from that might come interventions to improve matters.
The CEO of the Science Media Centre, Fiona Fox, says research into the causes of this hesitancy is key.
I don't know of a country where it's straightforwardly awful media, awful politicians leads to vaccine hesitancy. In the UK, brilliant media, brilliant politicians leads to, I don't think you could put it that straightforwardly. And I think all the way through this interview, I've been saying something similar, which is dig deep first, find out what it is.
The reasons for communities' vaccine hesitancy are complex and varied. So to get to grips with them, I've turned to social media. A great deal of Polish disinformation about the vaccine has been appearing online. I'm curious to know why it's been getting so much engagement. Ava Ferzinas is a social media content creator who moved from Poland to the UK 6 years ago. She talks me through some of the vaccine misinformation that's been spreading online. Looking at all this material might help me understand why so many Polish people are vaccine hesitant. One video that's been shared widely on Facebook provides a mistranslation of a TED Talk given by Bill Gates.
Prezentuję Państwu efekt ostatnich 10 lat mojej pracy. Brzmi to może niewiarygodnie, ale jest to właśnie rozwiązanie problemów współczesnego świata. W dzisiejszych czasach najskuteczniejszym sposobem na depopulację nie jest wcale wojna nuklearna, tylko zainicjowanie pandemii nowego groźnego wirusa. Nie pociski, ale mikroby. Nowe choroby, które pojawią się.
Original speech of Bill Gates without any sort of lecture or translation. He says essentially how the government, like the whole world, how they need to get ready because of the first SARS, then Ebola, that those pandemics will happen.
The video has been viewed almost 70,000 times and has received almost 1,000 reactions on Facebook.
But, yeah, like I reckon that my family has seen it. I mean, I'm sure. And I know that my friends' family probably have seen it too. So
We take a look at some of the comments on the video.
It's just scary because people seem to believe that, yeah.
It's clear that some Polish people are inclined to believe vaccine disinformation. To talk about this more, I went to Southend-on-Sea to speak with Barbara Solomons and her son Adam. Barbara moved to the UK almost 30 years ago and has family who still live in Poland. She told me how she felt about taking the vaccine.
I was feeling a little bit worried, a little bit apprehensive, because I love natural remedies and herbal-based remedies. That's what I prefer. Although I do use a normal conventional medicine as well.
It seems that Barbara's concerns stem from a distrust of the medical establishment. Many of her Polish friends in the UK were also reluctant to take the vaccine.
I did hear amongst my friends that there is quite a lot of disinformation on social media, and people tend to listen to that alternative news providers, because for us it's quite natural to tend to alternative news, because that's what we were doing throughout the communist era. We didn't really have reliable news outlets that we would be able to trust in. So we would turn into alternative news to find some truth in the world.
Obviously you can't overstate it, and you would need to see hard data on it, but I think Poland has spent such a long part of its recent history in a kind of Orwellian reality that when you get these YouTubers and these disinformation providers say that we are once again in that Orwellian reality, it doesn't seem beyond what could be. It doesn't seem as implausible as it would be in this country, for example. So fewer logical steps need to be taken to believe that the government is out to get you, or that this is a foreign plot, because they're things that have actually happened. So I think there is a big distrust in authority, and I think we are seeing that play out somewhat.
To find out about this sense of distrust, you need to dig deep into Poland's recent history. To do this, I visited the archives of the Polish Social and Cultural Association in Hammersmith.
This meeting, Jaruzelski and Mitterrand, Jaruzelski and Bush, a lot of people...
Poland was under Soviet occupation for over 4 decades following the Second World War. During this period, the Soviets rigorously controlled the public's access to information. With heavy propaganda, it wasn't long before Polish people became distrustful of the state. Speaking to someone who experienced government misinformation during this time is vital. That's why I got in touch with Anya Kokorum, who grew up in Poland in the 1950s and 60s. She experienced Soviet propaganda on a daily basis throughout her teenage years. It was so omnipresent that she says she had no reason not to believe it.
I didn't think that we had any kind of a regime. I thought it was a very nice country to live in. We had Russian at school and were encouraged to make friends with Russian children. I remember talking to my granddad when I was about 10 or 11 and saying, isn't that nice that we've got such a lovely, friendly country next door to us, and they are such great friends of ours. And my granddad said, well, they are not our friends at all. And he said they've got armies on our border and at any moment they could invade us. And I was absolutely shocked. I just thought, why would he say such a thing?
It was only when Anya moved to the UK 40 years ago that she found out about Soviet censorship and misinformation.
When I was in my early 20s, I came to the UK, and I had a chance to meet up with a lot of Polish expats who had been living here from the Second World War. And it was very interesting because they had a totally different perception of Poland than I did. I remember going to church with them, and they were praying for free Poland. And I was surprised, and I thought, how come you are praying for free Poland? Poland is free. So I went back after 2 years of being in England, and when we arrived in Poland, the thing that the custom officers were most interested in was any books, any printed material prior to 1939. They just wanted to know if I had any books or anything, any printing matter from before that time. Of course, now I know why, but they didn't want me to bring anything like that into the country. They took my luggage apart. I was being searched for about an hour. It left me very unsettled, all this, and I started looking at the country where I was living through a totally different light, and I didn't like it anymore.
The Katyń massacre, which involved the murder of over 22,000 Polish prisoners of war, was just one event that was covered up by the state, wiping out almost 40% of Poland's doctors, lawyers, teachers and journalists. The event remains one of the most traumatic incidents in Polish history.
I know that at some point, I think when I was in England, I found out about it. And then, of course, after the communism fell, there was a lot more coming out, and Polish people demanded apology and so on for it, because it was proved that it was the Soviets who have committed the massacre. But I don't think that I've heard about it because it would be kept quiet.
And so would you say, Anya, that all of this misinformation has caused a lot of Polish people to distrust authority today?
Of course, it's bound to. It's bound to, especially the older generation who lived through it. Certainly my generation and people who lived in it, they will certainly be very distrustful of it all, because we were already lied to once. So who is to say it's not happening again?
I'm here in Gunnersbury Cemetery, which houses a memorial to the Katyń massacre and thousands of Polish graves. Many of the people buried here fled to England during World War II and served as part of the British Armed Forces. When it became clear in 1947 that it would be too dangerous for some Poles to return to Soviet-occupied Poland, the Polish Resettlement Act was passed, giving 150,000 Poles British citizenship. Feelings of distrust were entrenched among this generation of Polish migrants for another reason.
Since the 18th century, Poland has been occupied by various countries, first by the Russians, the Prussians and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who split Poland between them over a period of 125 years. And then the Germans came and invaded and then occupied Poland. And then there was a brief period of respite before the Soviets came, and then Poland became a communist republic. And I think that this period, which lasted around 200 years, basically created a sense of insecurity among Polish people. They're always having to fight for their right to exist. And in Britain, I think we assume that our politicians, a lot of people assume that our politicians want the best for us. But in Poland, that hasn't been the case for a very long time, and I don't necessarily think it still is the case. And so Poles, they just don't trust authority in the same way.
I wanted to test the theory that this legacy of distrust has shaped Polish people's mentalities. So I met with Wiktor Myszyński, the leader of the Federation of Poles in Great Britain.
There's still this sort of feeling of stubbornness that seems to be innate. I mean, Poland had to recover initially from about 120 years when it ceased to exist, and then 20 years fighting for its independence, and then having lost that independence, trying to regain it, and eventually reaching it in 1990. And although initially you had a fairly liberal government and sort of westernized, there were certain elements within that sort of period of struggle, and so much blood was shed. There's this stubbornness against authority seems to be ingrained. In the 16th, 17th century, Poland was an oasis of tolerance, of religious tolerance, and the years of occupation steeled Poles into a far more defensive position.
While the reasons for vaccine hesitancy among British Poles are complicated, it seems cultural trauma and historic distrust have contributed to it. So what can be done to improve vaccine uptake among Polish people? Since the community is grappling with feelings of distrust, a good place to start would be to improve relations between British Poles and authorities.
What's happening is that I think there's a real big cultural disconnect among the authorities in this country, and they don't really know how to communicate with minorities of any group. And we're seeing that play out with Polish people, we're seeing that play out with all groups.
This disconnect was on display in April this year, when a Good Friday service at a Polish church in South London was shut down by police. The officers accused attendees of breaching social distancing restrictions, despite the church's insistence that all rules had been met.
At this moment in time, you need to go home. Failure to comply with this direction to leave and go to your home address ultimately could lead you to be fined £200, or if you fail to give your details, to you being arrested. I suggest, ladies and gentlemen...
In the last few days, I don't know if you saw what happened in Balham. There was a Polish church and the police kind of walked in and actually threatened to arrest people if they didn't go home. The confrontation shouldn't have happened. And I think the police have to have a long hard think about the way they relate to minority groups in this country. I really do.
A way of doing this could be to improve communication with the Polish community, especially on subjects like healthcare and vaccinations.
You need better translation services, and you need somebody, whether it's the social media sites or the government, to be bloody translating or putting some of this good information out there in Polish and other languages.
This, coupled with the way of actually counting how many Poles in the UK are being vaccinated. Looking at a stanzas form at a vaccine centre, there's no section asking for people's nationality.
The group that has been identified as vaccine hesitant would be Black, Asian and ethnic minorities. The Polish group as such fits into the white other category. So that means that Polish people are lumped with anyone else, so Canadians, Australians, Swiss. And of course, just the fact that you're white doesn't mean that you'll have a single attitude towards something like vaccine. But this does not appear in the data because there's no distinction based on nationality.
All this is crucial with the news that the AstraZeneca vaccine has caused a small number of blood clot cases. In April this year, it was reported that only 0.00017% of people had experienced rare blood clots after having their jabs.
I think Poles are very inclined to question things, like they don't take things at face value, and so when they start to see cracks appear, like that's when they start to get nervous. And so I definitely think that information like that has a massive impact on how they view the vaccine.
These measures could help establish trust within a community that has long felt left behind, and work towards fully including it in the largest immunisation effort of modern times.